Begin. If anyone comes in a bit late, let your friends know that we are recording this webinar. We'll share the link to the recording, and then there will be a follow-up email in next week with some more information I'll discuss in the presentation. So there's plenty of opportunity to get involved. Okay. My name is Melanie Sloane. I'm Senior Transportation Planner with TRPA, and I'm hosting this webinar today to provide an update on the project impact assessment process and the proposed mobility mitigation fee update. So I am just going to dive in. Some of this may seem familiar to those who are attending. It's the first few slides will focus on the project impact assessment and the recently adopted code changes for those updates. But there might be some new people and those who haven't tracked us closely. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to walk through those. And this is our agenda. Well, as I said, we'll start by reviewing those code changes to project impact assessment. We'll then shift to focus on the proposed changes to the mobility mitigation fee, and then review the next steps. What will happen after today? And I do want to hear from you, so I've saved some time for Q&A at the end. So let's start with the project impact assessment. Now, on April 28th, the TRPA board approved code changes to chapters 3 and 65, and that is to align with our VMT threshold update, that's that VMT per capita update, by ensuring that the project impact assessment process advances implementation of that VMT threshold at the project level. Additionally, we wanted to align with our California jurisdictions that are implementing project impact assessment updates themselves to align with state regulation under SB 743 in that state. So what the code changes really reflect or is reflected in this image right here, and that is the location of development matters, where we have development in and near to our town and regional centers. We see shorter trip lengths when a car must be used and more options for getting around, whether it's walking, biking, or transit. And there's a variety of destinations close enough to use those other choices, whereas development in more remote areas have fewer options to get around, fewer transportation options, as well as must drive longer distances. And so those code changes that were adopted in April really reflect that location of development matters. And this is a high-level overview of the code changes, and there's 3 components. First being the screening criteria. So that's essentially drawing that line to determine does a project have to do more and more detailed impact assessment? Second is what's called that standard of significance. That's a little bit wonky, but it's just defining the level for a project based on its land use type of how it should perform with the VMT it generates. And then mitigations, that's if that project doesn't screen and that project has VMT that's above those defined expectations of the standards of significance, it has to do more. And those more could be either the mobility mitigation fee or a combination of the mobility mitigation fee and strategies. So I'm going to go through a little bit more detail in the next few slides about each of those 3. First being that screening criteria, and that's that line that's drawn, that if a project is below the line, it pays the mobility mitigation fee and is required to do no additional analysis. Whereas if it's above the line, then it's evaluated against those defined expectations and standards of significance. So currently the line under the project impact assessment process is defined based on average daily trips. Currently, that's 200 average daily trips. And we through the code changes, retained that line and we translated it to VMT for projects that are in or near to town and regional centers. So for a project that's in a town or regional center or half mile around it, and it produces or generates 1,300 VMT, average daily VMT or less, it would screen. Now, all other areas, so outside of those town and regional centers and the half-mile buffer around them, if a project produces 715 average daily VMT or less, it would screen. Now, that other areas screen, that reflects guidance as well as recommendations for our California jurisdictions to use 110 average daily trips. So what we did was we took that 110 and we multiplied it by the regional average trip length of 6.53 miles, and it results in 715 VMT. That's also how we developed and retained that 200 average daily trip screen for our town and regional centers. 200 times the average regional trip length of 6.53 miles gets us to 1,300. So these are the two screening criteria under the adopted changes. So if a project doesn't screen, it does a little more analysis based on its land use type. And if it's above the defined expectation, the standard of significance, it's going to be required to do more at the project level through mitigations. Now, if a project doesn't screen, but based on its location and type and size, it is evaluated to be below that defined expectation, it would pay its mobility mitigation fee and its project impact assessment process would be complete. But again, above that defined level, it would be required to do more at the project level, and that's through mitigations. So mitigations have two forms, the mobility mitigation fee and site-specific strategies. Now, as I've said before, every project will pay a mobility mitigation fee. That's similar to the current process where every project that produces average daily trips pays a fee. Under the changed system, it would be based on VMT. So every project that produces new unmitigated VMT would pay the mobility mitigation fee. However, projects that don't screen, that were then did additional analysis and determined to generate VMT above that defined expectation or the standard of significance, would be required to do some site-specific strategies. Those mitigation strategies could be anything from maybe a tourist accommodation unit providing a shuttle for its tenants, or maybe it's an employment center, maybe a new medical complex. They could provide a shuttle for their employees or other trip reduction practices. And there are other items too under the mitigation strategies available to projects. That's just a sampling. But we do recognize there could be instances where a project applies every mitigation strategy but still has VMT to reduce. And so in the adopted code changes, contribution to the Mobility Mitigation Fund is also possible. And these are screenshots of an online project impact assessment tool being developed by TRPA staff. And I share it here because it brings those three components together in a visual way, which is always helpful, but it really brings them together in how it will operate once it goes into effect on June 26th. And what's really great about the two examples I've provided here is it brings us back to where we started in our conversation, and that is the location of a project really does matter because of the proximity, how close you are to all those destinations you want to get to, and what options you have to get there besides just the personal automobile. So on the left is a project that I've cited within a town center in South Lake Tahoe, in the city of South Lake Tahoe, in an area called the Tahoe Valley. And because this project is in an efficient and connected location in that town center, a development of 60 units of multifamily residential would be calculated at less than that 1,300 average daily VMT screen. And so for that project, it meets the screening criteria, and the fee, the mobility mitigation fee, would be calculated by the tool. And that project's impact assessment process would be complete and it would advance through the permitting process. On the right side is a similar development, but it's not in a town or regional center. I still cited it in South Lake Tahoe, but in a less efficient and less connected location. And in that, for that project, Because it's outside of the town center, it's held to that 715 VMT screening criteria. And you can see that the location, it really does influence the VMT calculation. And that project, 25 units, would not meet the screen. But what that project could still advance by applying those site-specific mitigation strategies. And those would be options in the tool, and they would also have their fee calculated there. Now, I want to be clear, the tool will be able to evaluate all project types for screening and do additional project impact assessment that is shown here for most projects. But commercial projects and recreation projects that do not meet the screening criteria, mixed-use redevelopment complex and projects and other complex projects, those would have to do more detailed VMT analysis outside of the tool. And that tool is currently in draft form. We had to do a little more work to be able to really implement that mixed use development and a few other aspects of implementing the project impact assessment code changes. But we are going to be bringing the tool forward for beta testing. And that date is now going to begin on Friday, June 18th, so next Friday. If you're interested in participating in beta testing the tool with us, we'd really appreciate the help. If you are interested, contact me or drop your name in the chat, and we will reach out to you when the tool is available for testing. So now let's switch to the proposed mobility mitigation fee updates. As I mentioned at the April 28th governing board meeting, the mobility mitigation fee was adopted into the code. Now, what the mobility mitigation fee does is it renames and replaces the current air quality mitigation fee. And it also changes how the fee is calculated. Currently, average daily trips to vehicle miles traveled. That aligns with the project impact assessment process. So what will be happening at the June Regional Plan Implementation Committee meeting and Governing Board is a proposal to do two things. One is to update the rules of procedure to translate the mobility mitigation fee to VMT. And secondly, to receive support for a planning process for providing a full update of the mobility mitigation fee program by the end of the year. So let's talk a little bit more about the current fee, that air quality mitigation fee, before talking about the changes. The air quality mitigation fee is currently set at $362.04, and it's calculated using average daily trips. And the fee charged to a project depends on the type of project being developed. That is, those project types that are considered to generate trips, that is the bed-based residential, tourist accommodation unit, and campgrounds, those are charged 90% of that fee of $362.04. With the remaining project types, those that attract trips, commercial, recreation, office, and others, are charged 10% of that fee, $362.04, 10% of that. Now, we renamed and replaced it to the mobility mitigation fee. And as I said, calculated according to VMT. And the framework that was adopted by the governing board in April also used that same apportioning, 90% of the fee rate to projects that generate vehicle miles traveled and 10% of the fee rate to projects that attract vehicle miles traveled. And what we propose currently is to simply translate the current fee rate of $362.04 to VMT. The calculation is shown here. So you've heard me mention a couple of times the average trip length, that's the average miles of a trip in Tahoe, is 6.53 miles. So we took the current fee rate and just divided it by the average trip, the average miles of a trip of 6.53 to get $55.44 per VMT. So essentially, what we're proposing for rules of procedure updates at the June meetings are not to change the fee, only to translate it to VMT. And that's because the first thing we'll do following governing board action is to begin a planning process to link the mobility mitigation fee program to the VMT reducing projects of the recently updated 2020 Regional Transportation Plan. That update will include robust stakeholder engagement as we bring forth approaches to the mobility mitigation fee update, as well as going to and receiving policy guidance from the Regional Plan Implementation Committee, so that then we can bring forth a recommendation to the governing board by the end of the year for an update to the mobility mitigation fee program, as well as the fee rate itself. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, another next step following our conversation today is to do beta testing of the project impact assessment tool. And again, drop your name in the chat, get in touch with me otherwise if you would like to take part in that beta testing. We would really appreciate the help. And then the code change updates go into effect on June 26th, and that follows a required 60-day period from the April 28th governing board meeting. So those are the things happening in the near and through the end of the year around the mobility mitigation fee update, as well as the project impact assessment process. So that concludes my presentation, and now's the time we get to move to Q&A. So I'd